Singularity.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Exponential technology.
Do you want to know what it is?
As Patrick mentioned, it's my great pleasure to be here today and to get to present kind of the foundational talk to help you put some of the things that you're going to hear over these next few days in context. So one of the great things about my job at SU is I get to spend a lot of time talking to amazing people, amazing speakers, amazing entrepreneurs, and I get to spend a lot of time thinking about where the world is going. And for me, it's become very clear that this is an incredibly exciting time. The world is going through some dramatic transitions. We're seeing a whole new world of possibilities presenting themselves. So every day we're seeing news of where the world is going. Kind of this future tense is now becoming very much part of our reality. In the medicine and healthcare space, we're seeing artificial intelligence that's now doing an extraordinary job of diagnosing cancer, or liquid biopsies that's being used to detect cancer at its very earliest stages. These are tools and technologies now that are completely transforming what it means to provide medicine and healthcare. We're seeing extraordinary things that are happening with transportation, whether it's autonomous vehicles like buses, planes, cars, and airplanes, or it's the energy that powers them, hydrogen, electric, wind. All these things that are enabling us now to provide not only new products and new services, but to offer them in a way that is actually very helpful or positive now for our environment. And please let me know if I'm going too fast or too slow, and so I can keep the right cadence. To that point, with Germany, we've just recently seen that they are completely re-architecting their energy ecosystem. So you're seeing this actually throughout the world, but Germany being a really terrific example. Earlier this year, they received 85% of their energy from renewable sources. So you think about that, 85%. You can imagine that this is going to be something that's going to be more and more frequent, and it's something I think that frankly would have been very difficult for us to imagine even kind of 2 or 3 years ago. We're seeing things happen with Bitcoin and blockchain or Ether and Ethereum that are completely redefining not only what money looks like, but what commerce looks like. We're seeing exciting things happen with robotics as well. I mean, robots now that are absolutely astounding and amazing us and providing all sorts of services from manufacturing and building homes to personal care. And one of the most exciting things we're seeing right now is that some of the world's global grand challenges, these are areas that we've identified that are some of the biggest problems in the world where we think technology can play an important role, and where you'll be hearing from my colleague Nicholas Hahn later on. We're seeing them now really start to attack some of these problems and solve some of these problems. So for us as a benefit corporation that's focused on impact and trying to move the world forward in a positive direction, that's incredibly exciting and encouraging for us. And also kind of one of the broader themes that we're seeing is that now for the first time really, it feels like really what is good for the world is also very much good for business. So historically, I think those things have oftentimes been disconnected, and now we're seeing them come together. And so technology is being used to create great products and great services, but also having a positive impact on the world, especially on the environmental side. So at SU, we focus on 8 exponentially accelerating technology areas. So these are neuroscience, biotech, robotics, energy, computing, AI, medicine, and nanotechnology. So these are 8 areas that we think are going to have some of the biggest impact going forward. They're areas that we think you need to pay a lot of attention to, and that if you understand what's going on there, it's going to give you some great insights into thinking about how you might develop new businesses and new products. So to that point, though, you're going to hear, I think, throughout this the next 2.5 days, we're not going to, we'll dive into individual technologies and individual areas, but we're going to talk a lot about this term convergence, which for us means 2, 3, 4 different, sometimes more, technology areas coming together and working to create significant breakthroughs. So these are the areas, or these are the times that we do see some of the most kind of unexpected things happening, and it's because of the unexpected combination of these different technologies. So at the beginning of this talk, I talked about some of the headlines that are happening, right? Some of the things that are happening in the world, and I get to spend, a lot of my time thinking about that world, looking at what's going on, and I find myself often being startled by these headlines. And really, that these things are happening now sometimes is really amazing to me, and I think to a lot of people. And I think it's interesting to kind of step back and ask yourself why that is. Why are we continuously caught off guard by these new advancements that are taking place? And so to understand that, I'm going to talk now a little bit about exponential growth versus linear growth. So what does exponential mean, right? We hear this term all the time. Peter Diamandis, one of our co-founders at SU, has been one of the core advocates for helping educate people about it and spread its use throughout the world. It's a mathematical term. I think kind of the simplest way to kind of boil it down is it's something that is growing at a set rate, basically, at a set period of time. So, for example, something might be doubling every second. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. That is an example of exponential growth, and it could be doubling, it could be tripling. But what's interesting is exponential thinking doesn't come naturally to us, and that's really why we're caught off guard so often. So our brains went through their major evolution hundreds of thousands of years ago, right? The world looked very, very different at that point. It was very much local, it was very much linear. Kind of the world you were born into was basically the world that you would die in. And things, you were only kind of concerned about what was happening in the most immediate areas around you. So you fast forward to today, the world is global, obviously, and it's exponential, which is why we're here. So things are happening on the other side of the world. We hear about them in minutes. We might have computers that will hear about them in seconds or milliseconds. The rate at which things are changing and the scope at which they're changing that we need to pay attention to is so profound and so different, and it's not the way we're naturally programmed. So this chart is from Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near. This is his law of accelerating returns. In this, you can see kind of 5 distinct paradigms of technology, of which Moore's law is only the most recent. So what's interesting is if you look at this, you'll basically see it goes all the way back to 1890, which is the first electrical mechanical calculator, which was used for the US Census, and then comes all the way through the integrated circuit and present day. You can also notice that it's a very smooth curve, right? And we know that technology and the world is not that smooth. So why is that? You can basically think of that curve as made up of a series of different technologies. And each of these technologies is essentially an S-curve. So it starts off in the early days, there's not much going on. It's quiet. It's deceptive in terms of the capabilities of that technology, that product. All of a sudden, it kind of enters into its heyday. And then at some point, it kind of reaches a maximum, and things kind of wane. And at that point, what you see is a new technology coming online. And so it's this series of these nested S-curves that essentially allow you to see a very smooth curve and to have confidence that the world will, one technology will step in and continue to drive the world forward. So it's interesting if you look at this chart here, and understand that exponential technology growth and make the leap that while we don't know what the sixth paradigm of computing is going to be, we know that there's going to be a sixth paradigm. And if you make that leap, then you can start to make some assumptions. And that's enabled people like Ray Kurzweil to become one of the most accurate futurists in history, really. And Ray has predicted that by 2030, we will have a computer for $1,000 that will be as powerful as a single human mind. And he's also predicted then by 2050, we will have a $1,000 computer that will be as powerful as all human minds combined. So you just think about holding that power, having it on your desktop, having it on a phone. What does that world look like? What are you able to do as a product or a service? What type of processing and might you be able to do? And it's really extraordinary to kind of start to think about that. And if you view the world that way, you can start to really think about, okay, if I know what processing power and the price point is likely to be, what type of services, what type of products might I be able to bring to market? So now I want to take you through just an abstract example of exponential growth. So in this chart, imagine a room that can hold up to 1 billion gallons. It starts off with 1 gallon, it's growing, doubling every minute. You can see basically almost nothing is happening, right, until about this point at the 25th minute. At the 25th minute, 95% of the room is still full, is empty. And you'll see what happens. It's those last 5 minutes where there's this dramatic change as each of the previous steps are doubling. And so at the 29th minute, the room is half full, and at the 30th minute, it's completely full. And it's this curve and this type of growth when technologies are, going through this rapid doubling every year or 2 years that is what creates so much kind of deception and surprises us so often. So let's talk about a few examples of exponential growth in the real world. I think one of the most interesting examples is the human genome and the sequencing effort that took place starting in 1990. So it took 7 years for us to sequence the first 1% of the human genome, and it cost us $1 billion. For folks who thought in a linear way, you could extrapolate that out to mean that we had 700 years to go, and it might cost us $700 billion, right? A total disaster. No one could afford it. We don't have that much time, obviously. But for people who understood exponential growth, they knew that we were actually almost done. And so that's one of the most powerful kind of ahas, is to going from 700 years to, it's just going to be a few more doublings and then we'll be done. And so it took us 6 more years, and it took $1.7 billion more dollars, so $2.7 billion total, and the human genome was sequenced. And you can kind of see what's happened over time, right? As we've continued to see these technologies improve and the price performance improve, you can now get a genome sequenced for under $1,000. And that's the power of this exponential growth. And some of my colleagues think that essentially is going to become free in the not too distant future. So let's do a few more examples here. Storage. 1956, you could get 5 megabytes of storage for $120,000. 2005, you could get 128 megabytes for about $99. Fast forward to today, you can get over 128 gigabytes for under $30, representing a 90 million-fold improvement in that period, price performance improvement. This is Steven Sasson. He is the founder or creator of the first digital camera. This is actually a picture of the first digital camera. You can see why the board of Kodak did not think that this was necessarily going to be a huge hit. It weighed about 4 pounds, cost about $10,000, had a 0.01 megapixel resolution. Fast forward, though, to today, and there's been about a 5 billion-fold improvement in price performance. And so you can get a digital camera now for 16 megapixels for half a gram that costs under $10. And that trend is continuing to move forward. So now I want to take a second, and we've talked about kind of some examples of exponential technology. Let's talk about kind of how that impacts and creates markets. So we're going to take a look at the robotics market here, and look in particular at startups. So we're going to start in 2000. So these are robotic startups that were funded in the year 2000 and were actively operating. You can see very little activity. You can see there's not a lot of clustering. This is the early days. The technology is still relatively nascent, and these are definitely what you would call early adopters. 2005, you can see that this network is starting to become more robust, right? We're starting to see more clustering of activity. You're starting to see some connectivity that's taking place, some interaction, but it's still very, very early. So now 2010, very different landscape, right? The technology has become more and more powerful, less and less expensive. We're seeing all sorts of different converging technologies now working together. And so you've got a much more robust network, probably approaching close to 1,000 startups right now that are operating. And then we fast forward to today, and you can see there's been a further explosion. And so you've got a really, really robust environment, thousands and thousands of startups that are now at work, all sorts of different major new areas that have developed and really created a real gravity there. So if you're a large company, or even if you're a smaller company, right, and you're competing against the pace of change, the frenzy of activity that's taking place, like these are intense times, and in many ways scary times, I think. And so it's interesting as you look at the data. If you go back to the 1920s in the U.S., look at companies that made it to the Standard & Poor 500 index. Those companies had about a 70-year run as a public company. So you made the investment, you built your company, you got it to a certain level, and you got to kind of reap your rewards for quite a while. Fast forward to today, though, and that window has now shrunk down to about 15 years and is shrinking. So it's, there's a much faster cycle now, a much tighter window. If you look at the Fortune 500, it's predicted that 40% of those companies on the Fortune 500 will no longer exist in 10 years. And again, just kind of speaks to the rate of change and the pace at which companies are being birthed and kind of reaching their peak, and that they're either being acquired or they're dying out as new competitors and new technologies emerge. So that's pretty stressful, right? That's a pretty intense environment to operate on, and knowing that it's only going to get more intense and busier, and there'll be a faster rate of change. One could walk away from that feeling, pretty despondent and pretty hopeless about what the future looks like for careers and for companies. One of our big goals for this event, though, is to actually get you energized, get you excited about this as an opportunity, because we believe that this is the most amazing time to be alive as human beings, that we have the chance to create something truly extraordinary, both in individual companies and the world as a whole. So to kind of flip that thinking, you need to kind of understand what an abundant mindset is. And you may have heard Peter Diamandis talk about this, seen this in some of his books, or potentially read this in Bold or Abundance. I want to tell you a little bit about abundant thinking. And it's basically technology is a force which takes something that is scarce and makes it abundant. So it's a very simple way of thinking through the world, but we have kind of created this framework that we think is reproducible and kind of shows the natural flow that information technology and exponential growth has. And so I'd like to walk you through that really quickly. We call this the 6 Ds. This is also crafted by Peter Diamandis. So what happens in the earliest days is something becomes digitized, right? So it becomes an information technology, bits and bytes. In those early days, though, at the beginning of this curve, it's extremely deceptive. So again, you see an example of a drone in the early days, or a robot, or artificial intelligence. People are quick to kind of push it aside as something that we cannot take too seriously. And they don't, or like the digital camera, right? You don't see, like, what is that going to actually mean? Or the cell phone. How is that going to impact our world going forward? What happens, though, is after, in the next step of the curve, we start to see some disruption. All right, people are caught off guard. The price performance of these devices, what they're capable of, is starting to change dramatically, and people are starting to take notice. We also see next that things become dematerialized. So you could think back to computers or devices that may have taken up rooms or may have required multiple devices to get the same thing done, and they're now getting boiled down to much smaller size and potentially single devices, or potentially being completely dematerialized and just residing in the cloud. We then start seeing things become demonetized. So they cost less and less and less over time as the price performance curve continues to move forward. And then ultimately, some of these things actually become free. And as part of that journey, they then become democratized, right? So they're available everywhere. They're ubiquitous. And so while we're seeing parts of the developing world that all of a sudden has access to these incredible technologies, more power than the President of the United States had back in '92 is now in your cell phone that's available everywhere. That's part of the 60s in this process, and it's an incredibly consistent and powerful force. So what's exciting to us at SU is that we really are starting to see this transition into an abundant world. And you wouldn't know this from the news today, because there's, I guess as they say, if it bleeds, it leads. But there is so much that's happening right now that is very, very positive, and this is the best time to be alive as a human being. So we're seeing that, for example, with the end of poverty. Dramatic decreases in the number of people who are living below the poverty line. We see this in the waning of war, right? It's the safest time to ever be alive. Less wars, further and further in between, less casualties as a result. We're seeing this with worldwide life expectancy. Japan obviously leading the way on this. And my colleague Ray Kurzweil at our global summit just about a month ago espoused that he thought that within 12 years we would be adding more than a year of life for every calendar year. So you start to think about what that means for changing the equation. We're also seeing a dramatic decrease in automobile and airline fatality rates, so plummeting. And you can imagine as autonomous vehicles come online that there's an opportunity to save another kind of 1 million to 2 million lives every year, not to mention all the injuries that happen as a result of that. Technology making the world a better place. We're also seeing dramatic changes in terms of the number of people who have access to the internet. So I think this is one of the most exciting opportunities for businesses as you think forward. There will be, over 3 billion people that are going to be coming online over the next decade. People who have an opportunity to buy products and services, and even more important, to contribute. So to have access to the world's information, to make their own mark on moving the world forward. I think that is going to absolutely accelerate dramatically the pace of change. And so hopefully that has kind of framed up exponential thinking and an abundant mindset. I mean, I really think that these are such critical concepts to grasp. I'm happy to chat with anyone about this afterwards. The world is changing, as you know, faster and faster. I saw a really fascinating study come out of Stanford University earlier this week where they predicted basically within 8 years the end of the combustion engine. So that cars would, basically combustion engine driven vehicles would cease to exist. They would become no longer economically viable. And that would trigger then the collapse of oil. It's not 50 years that they're predicting, it's not 25 years, it's 8 years. And that's the power of exponential technology. With that, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure to be with you. Arigato. Yeah.
Thank you.